been just a little wonky. So if at any point my internet goes a little weird, please let me know, and I will try to fix it. Can everyone hear me okay? And is everything okay? Awesome. Okay, so I think we should just dive right in. I wanted to talk about the invisible door in poetry. And when I say the invisible door, I'm talking about that thing, that moment. Sometimes I think it's often the turn in a poem, the moment in the poem where it's like, oh, this is where the poem was leading to, but it can also just be that kind of feeling that the poem is taking you somewhere deeper. So it's kind of both the turn and that kind of ineffable quality in a poem. And I think it's really powerful and also really hard to teach, right? Because oftentimes, when we're writing poems, we don't really know, like, you don't, it would feel, I think, a bit contrived to go into a poem and be like, and this is exactly how where it's meant to end up, right? Because then there's no discovery. And so I've been very fascinated by this topic for a really, really long time. And I think the reason is because I'm just not, you always want to have that, like, this is how you make an interesting metaphor. This is how you make an interesting simile. And there's so many things that can be taught, but it feels very hard to teach something that feels, kind of out in the ether. It doesn't feel so strictly defined. But I do think that there are things that we can look at, the kind of moments that can kind of help us enter into poems more deeply, both when we're reading them and when we're writing them. That's kind of what I wanted today's workshop to be about. Not necessarily, it's not going to be as formulaic as, do this, this, and this, but it is kind of like, here's a way to look at your own work and potentially make it go a little deeper or make it go somewhere surprising. So I wanted to share with you a couple of poems, and we'll kind of, discuss them. I do want it to be an open discussion because I think it's useful. Because also there's no, when I say like, where is the invisible door in this poem, there's not going to be like a right or wrong answer because I'm not talking about the turn. I'm not talking about, although it can be, but it can be anything, and it can be, oh, this felt to me like the door in the poem. This is where I entered into this poem more deeply. And that's also worth looking at and discussing. So I do want to leave that open to discussion too. But I really like Alison, the poet Alison Luterman. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but I think she's fabulous. And she has this phrase where she says, it's like the world inside the world. And I feel very much that that's kind of what we're looking at. Like, where is the world inside the world of this poem? Um, And then another quote that I really like, and this is all in my workshop handout, so you will all be getting that, and we can, so you have these quotes to kind of look at and mull over. Um, but there's another quote that I wanted to look at, which is by the artist Richard Demoncorn, and he said, I don't go into the studio with the idea of saying something. What I do is face the blank canvas and put a few arbitrary marks on it that start me on some sort of dialogue, which I really like because I think that when we're writing poems, we do want to open a dialogue with ourselves as well as with our readers. We want to be, both thinking about what we're thinking about. I think that's a lot of what I'm talking about is like really looking at your own work and kind of going like, where is there a way for me to enter this poem in a new way? And by enter the poem, I mean enter into your own subconscious or your own kind of feelings more deeply. So I'm gonna share my screen. Hold on one second. And I'm gonna ask for a volunteer to read this poem. If not, I'm totally fine with reading it. But if anyone wants to, you can raise your hand and I will call on you. But let me pull it up first. Okay. Oh, can you enable screen sharing for me?
Gotcha.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is the poem Jump by Alison Luterman. Do I have any volunteers? If anyone?
I'll read it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Because my car is 20 years old and the gizmo that goes ding, ding, ding when you leave the lights on has been busted for at least a decade. I'm always contending with a comatose battery, always approaching strangers to ask for a jump in the Trader Joe's parking lot or on a deserted street in the growing park, where a man in a python green Porsche affixed fixated. Oh no, sorry. Isn't that a word I'm used to? The red and black alligator claims confidently yet incorrectly, killing the thing altogether, resulting in a 10 p.m. call to AAA. An hours long wait in a 7-Eleven and a midnight ride sitting in the cab, or a tow truck whose driver has just been dumped by his wife or of 11 years. These are the adventures you may have if you tend to leave your lights on, as I do. At dusk, where the light is tricky, the hour between the dog and wolf, the French call it, when the distracted mind is too full of shadows to remember what the body did just moments ago. But now I'm an old hand at setting up cables, fitting black to minus, red to plus. But I'll never get over the small miracle of how fast it all works. The spark, are quicker than thought. As soon as a benefactor turns their ignition to switch, my own car springing to life again, like Sleeping Beauty after just the right kiss. That's a bar right there. The way a smile will ricochet from a stranger's face to my own, or one kind word retrieve a flailing soul from the abyss. Yo, that's a dope poem.
Yes, I agree. I love that poem. And I love Alison Literman. I think she's fabulous. Everyone, if you have not been introduced to her work, I highly recommend all four of her books. One of them is kind of tricky to get, but I was able to find it on eBay. But yeah, I think she's fabulous. Does anyone else have thoughts on this poem? It can be, deep, or it can just be, I like this line, or, I'm very curious. If not, I'm happy to gush about it myself.
I do. Um, I just loved how vivid the story was and how it told the minute details of getting a jump at the same time that it told about her own habit of leaving the lights on and relying on strangers underneath it all. I just thought it was a wonderful piece of work.
Yes, I completely agree. I think this poem is stunning. And yeah, I think that the details really bring you into this poem. Like, you know, the trade, like, I love that it's a Trader Joe's parking lot and not just a normal parking lot because it really sets the scene and also just brings it into like the really everyday of it all. Like, there's nothing really fancy going on. They're not in like the parking lot of like a kid's recital or something like where you're like, okay, something meaningful is about to happen. Like, this is just day-to-day groceries and chores and stuff. And I love that. And then there's like, there's 7-Eleven, there's the things around them, like a man in a python green porch and just kind a Porsche, not porch, but like there's just all these really, really rich details that kind of set it. But the details are so kind of like boring, but not. Like
Yeah.
there's a richness to them, but they would seem like on the surface if I was like, can you write me a poem in a Trader Joe's parking lot and include a 7-Eleven, include like some cars and some batteries, like I would be like, that sounds like a really boring poem. And at no point am I reading this poem and thinking this is a boring poem. And yeah, and I love it. And I think that one of the things that I love and that we can take away from this poem is like she's really talking about something that happens again and again in her life that's really kind of boring. And I think sometimes we tend to write about like these big moments, but she's talking about like something that's clearly something that happens like often. And I think that that's like those are the moments that we often don't think to write about because it keeps happening. So for us, it's not interesting. But like I've never like needed a jump for a car. Also I don't really drive, so that's probably why. But like if I did, I probably wouldn't, if this kept happening to me, I probably wouldn't even think to write about it because I think the more something happens to you, the less likely you are to like write about it, especially when it's involved in like such a domestic task. So I think that there's like definitely a prompt in here, like write about like an everyday annoyance that constantly occurs, and try to give it more meaning and depth because I think that's really where this poem shines because we really start off like because my car is 20 years old and the gizmo that goes ding 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 when you leave the lights on has been busted for at least a decade. Like we know that this is not a new thing.
You know,
She
One of the
it,
things I like about the poem is that the end ties into the beginning,
yes.
and that this is a comatose battery that's
Mhm.
brought back to life at the end. And part of the miracle of it is
Yes.
seeing that it is a small miracle, that you can bring this thing back to life no matter how many times it dies. And even if you have to call AAA, it comes back to life. And to see the miracle of how that happens is in the every day that we bring things to a moment of mutual understanding of how unusual that is because, they're smiling at each other
Right. Yeah.
is what I like the best about it anyway.
Yes, I completely agree. And you segued so perfectly into like what I wanted to really get into with this poem, which is that invisible door, which I do think very much you can very much see it right in the part that you're talking about, which is that the small miracle. And I think that the part of the miracle of it is the miracle of noticing the miracle.
Yeah.
Um, and I really think that that's what we're talking about when we talk about the invisible door is like the miracle of noticing something as a miracle. Because this could easily have been a moment that was completely overlooked, but because she looked at it more deeply, she gave it meaning. And I think that that's very much what we're talking about when we're talking about that invisible door is that moment where a poem goes from something you're just talking about to something that you're engaging with so deeply that it's taken out of the realm of the everyday and into like this sort of, spiritual or, grateful or, really deep kind of place. And I think that that's what makes this poem, I think, does it really, really well and in a very blatant manner. Although I think all good poems do this. But I just think it's really, really beautiful. And I do think that that's something that we can all do in our work is like, say like, well, where is the miracle in this? Whether good or bad. Like sometimes it can be, the miracle of realizing that, you know,
Miracle to me isn't even in the regeneration of the card. It's in the ricochet from the stranger's face to your
Yeah.
own.
Yeah. I
It's
mhm.
in the
agree.
mutual recognition of something beyond the ordinary happening.
Hmm.
That's where it hit me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that connection too. In a moment that maybe you might not notice the connection. It might just be like this tough annoyance thing, but like because it's being noticed and being witnessed, all of a sudden it takes on this really deep meaning. I think that connection is often a way to get to that deeper place in a poem, like you said with the smile. And also I love that she uses the word ricochet. Like that particular word choice, I think is really powerful and it really shows like the power of using kind of an unexpected word in a poem to kind of take it from, like it sticks out in your mind. Like it really draws attention to itself. So you go like, this is an important line. You should be listening. And so I think that that's really, really nice. And she has this, like, she obviously has this beautiful, like, sleeping beauty after just the right kiss, which is really lovely. And ricochet is kind of like a crunchier word. Like it's not as lovely, but in drawing attention to itself, I think it does a lot of work in a very good way. So that's also like, and also you have ricochet and then retrieve, which is really nice. You've got these two like multi-syllabic, R words, which I think creates like a really nice like sonic resonance from line to line, which is really, really beautiful. Um, but yeah, I think it's always interesting to see like, where can a word do more work, or call your attention to the right spot, especially because, you've got smile and stranger, which are like two kind of common words. And this line, I think, could have maybe veered into like kind of cliche territory. And by using this kind of surprising language around it, like it doesn't feel at all like that. And even with, I think she does it again here brilliantly with a flailing soul, not just a soul, which I think if the line had just said, or one kind word, retrieve a soul from the abyss, I really do feel like this poem, like as lovely as it is, would have fallen a little bit flatter, I don't think it would have been nearly as powerful. There's this kind of, in the way that a lot of the details in this poem, I think, make it feel very real. There's something about the word flailing soul and not trying to make it overly beautiful, because the word flailing implies like all the hardship and the awkwardness and the struggle of life. Um, it makes me trust what she's saying more because she's really like admitting like we have a flailing soul, like we're human, even with this big revelation and this gorgeous like truth that's being presented here, like, it still ends on more truth. Like, I just think it's really, really powerful. And that kind of shows the power of tension when you add like something kind of less beautiful to something beautiful, how it almost elevates it even more because the reader trusts you more. You're not trying to make something overly beautiful, which I think is really, really, really a powerful tool that we can all use in our poetry. Like, am I trying to make something so beautiful that potentially I've lost my reader's trust? And, I think that she very much does not do that here, and it's really, really powerful. And also, even when she goes into the kind of more poeticized language, like the turn, I would say, is probably like the hard turn of this poem is probably these are the adventures you may have. But even when she's making this turn and now we're headed into like the more insightful part of the poem, she never leaves the realness of the poem behind. She keeps like, she's got the setting up the cables and the flailing black to minus and the red to plus, and that's these details, like she carries it throughout the poem. And I'm really, really glad that she did because I think it's if she had kind of just gone off into that, I think maybe we could have been a little lost or felt like a little almost like we were being preached to, but because she doesn't, I think we ended up in like a really, really beautiful place. Does anyone have any final thoughts on this poem before we move on?
I do. We kind of touched on it, and this is probably a little more general compared to what everyone else says, but I think she does a really good job of creating tension through the first half of the poem by using words like comatose, um, deserted street, python green, black alligator killing. Like she goes through, and then when it's adventures, it starts to get a little more positive, and then once you hit small miracle, it's like, okay, spark arcing, benefactor, springing to life, sleeping beauty, right kiss, ricochet from stranger's face. I just really like the turn in word choice.
Yes, I completely agree. And again, I think that that shows like how well crafted this poem is. Um, in that she's, not afraid to use like really honest language about the circumstances, but also like, she's very it's very grounded. This poem feels very grounded. Like I like that we've got sound right in the beginning. We've got ding ding ding. Like that's kind of tricky in a poem to start off with sound. I feel like usually poems will start off with like an image or an idea, but she really grounds us. Like she's like, okay, this is like the particular sound that the car is making. Like we are in a scene. Like it feels almost like the opening of a a movie or something. Like we're being set up to really be in this moment, which is really it's really powerful. And yeah, I think all the language, I love that you mention like the python green and the deserted street. She really goes out of her way to make it clear. And she's not afraid to take her time either, which I really appreciate about this poem because I think sometimes it can feel a little scary to take your time with setting something up because it can feel like, oh, it's going to be boring. But I think what saves this poem from being boring is she's almost creating tension by setting us up in this such an ordinary scene. We're like, where is this going? Like, what's going to happen here? And she's not afraid to like let us just sit with that, like, where the heck is this poem? Like, is she gonna pull this off? Like, we're just sitting and we're in a Trader Joe's. Like, what the heck? And but it does, and I don't think it feels boring at all. But I do think, and also I think she also does this in subtle ways too, where she keeps us hooked by like, lines like, I'm always contending with a comatose battery. Like, obviously the comatose is a really vibrant word, which I love, but there's also this sound. I'm always contending with a comatose battery. Like that sounds great. So we kind of trust her. Like we're like, okay, she knows that this is not like, fluff that didn't get cut. Like this is not like an unedited poem that didn't get cut. Like something's going on here. Like this is all very, very intentional. Like the always approaching strangers. Like she uses, sound and like very precise words to kind of keep us in it, even when we're not really in it yet. So I think that that's really, really brilliant. And I think that that's kind of speaks to too what I wanted to talk about with like that invisible door. Not only how do we create that invisible door in our poems, but how do we set it up so the reader can trust that that door is coming? And that we don't always need to start off. I mean, sometimes we can. There's no right. I'm not Nothing I'm saying here is prescriptive. It's not going to work for every single poem. Like there are poems that we need to just dive right in and we don't need all this setup, but I do think it's worthwhile to look at what is working and why. And I do think that this setup gives us all this trust so that when she introduces that door, like this is like a miracle. We're there. We trust her. So I think yeah, that's really beautiful. Anyone else before we move on? Okay, we're going to move on to the next poem by Danusha Ramirez. Do I have a volunteer to read this one?
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
Because something happens, then ends, then something else happens, and you forget what came before. You know how it is. Once you ate apples on the back porch, tossed the cores into the wet grass. Once you rode horses to a lookout high in the mountains, into the underbelly of the sky. Remember so and so? Remember when it used to rain in winter? Remember when you wore your hair short, dyed pink, pierced your ears all the way to the rim? You were someone else who had also been someone else. And who will you be next? Today I walked down the beach holding hands with a man who used to be a microscopic dot. Now he has a beard and plays a guitar. I was a microscopic too, but now someone says, Danishu, Danishu? And I say yes, temporary. One day they will say cloud, and I will turn my head, not head, and answer.
Thank you so much for reading. That was beautiful. Any thoughts on this poem?
Um, so you had mentioned in the last poem, and that happened to me in this poem, like where are we going with this? And so like obviously we have the title first, and then it was that like that point, you were someone else who had also been someone else, and who will you be next? Like that really like stuck out to me. Um, because I think that resonates with all of us. We were all a thing before, you know? So those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I like that you found that connection between, the last poem because that is very much what I want us to be looking at is like where are we going with this? And I think this poem, the reason why I put this poem after the last poem is because this poem does it in a very different way. We're not really given the kind of vibrant details that were given in the last poem, and I think it works beautifully in this poem. And it's a completely different approach, which is why I really want to emphasize that like nothing I'm saying is prescriptive because there's so many ways in which different methods work for different um, poets. Actually, Janusha has like a brilliant workshop. It's called The Nine Lenses of Poetry, where she talks a lot about this kind of idea of like there are different types of poets who do very different work. Because I think oftentimes a poet will teach one type of poem, which will be like here's the narrative poem, or here's like this kind of lyrical, mysterious, ethereal poem, and they'll be like, and then there are the rules, but they won't really present them as rules for that type of poem. And that really shifted my thinking about poetry because for so long I was like, okay, well, I'm not supposed to do that. But no, it's for that specific type of poem. Usually those things do or don't work. And I think that she kind of opened that up. And this is the kind of poem where Danusha thrives. It's less narrative. It has beautiful details and very striking details, but they're not details to set up a story. They're details to set up an idea. Um, and I feel like it's just as successful as the last poem. But I do think that is something that I really wanted to point out here when I'm talking about that invisible door, because that is a through line through, I think, all poems like that are well executed is this deepening into something, but it doesn't always have to be the same way. I love a great narrative poem, and I love a poem like this that really makes me think. And there's also like this beautiful grounding that she does because we're kind of in a weird place. Like it's, because something happens that ends. Because what happened? Like, where the heck are we going? It's easy to forget where you've been. Okay, that title doesn't give us much information. It's a nice title, but it doesn't really give us much. So then you're kind of expecting something in the first line, and then we're get not given any information. Then something else happens, and you forget what came before. We're still not given any information, and she's really building this. And then I think where she really shows that, for me, the moment in the poem where I trust this poet is that very next line where she says, "You know how it is." And I'm like, okay, she knows what she's doing. She's definitely playing with our expectations. She's creating tension and not giving us any information. Because I'm like, do I know? Yeah, I guess I do know how it is. And I really trust her in that moment that she's playing with us a little bit. And she's being playful. And then she gives us once you ate apples on the back porch, which is a nice little detail. So I think that, in this way, the poet enters the poem in a completely different way, and it's equally as effective. And she's building tension in a different way where we're like, what? 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 And then we get, okay, wait a minute. We're talking kind of more, we're in a more feeling space. We're not in a narrative space, and we have to be comfortable with that. Um, and then she gives us another detail, and she gives us that repetition too with the once. Um, but what's really nice is she's not afraid to give us repetition and then take it right away. We have the once, then we have remember, remember, remember. And then she abandons it. So this poem really does play with a lot of things that we see in poetry, and she's not afraid to use it and then take it away, to use it and then take it away. And it's really effective. Because again, I feel like these moments are these moments of like building tension. Like, where is this going? Where is this going? And I think it's beautiful. Any other thoughts?
I
I
like
felt
the
like there
candor.
was a traditional turn at today I walked down the beach. Like we're grounded somewhere specific now in the narrator's perspective.
Yes. And that's a really I mean, I love that you brought that up because for me, that's what's really striking about this poem is that it turns on a narrative moment, which is really strange for a poem that's like kind of distinctly not narrative. And then to be like, oh, and now I'm going to give you like a little piece of narrative. Today I'm walking on a beach, and you're like, oh, okay. And it really draws your attention to that moment, which is really beautiful. And then she immediately kind of pulls back out again, though, which is kind of fun because we're in this moment, we're walking on the beach with a man who used to be a microscopic dot. Like we're kind of back out and we're like looking at the bigger picture of like what this means. Which is, I just think is a really, really fun choice. And again, this kind of really subtle moment, like of, the sound is really nice. A man who used to be a microscopic dot, she's using a lot of single syllable words here to create that kind of like, bumpy kind of nice rhythm, and it's beautiful. And then she has this really probably maybe one of my favorite details in all these poems was now he has a beard and plays guitar. It's such a simple moment of detail, but it's so striking because we had this microscopic dot and then beard and plays guitar. And that's like one of those moments where the description is so endearing. Like you feel like this speaker really likes whoever this person is talking about. Like there's something about um, certain details have the power to show a connection between people without ever saying that connection. Like she doesn't, other than the fact that she's holding hands with this person in this poem, she doesn't really say what this person means to her. And it could also be like she could be a first date. It could be like we have no idea. But the fact that she's saying now he has a beard and plays guitar, there's something so endearing about that. Like, you know, it's like it's a physical attribute and a playful, it has this kind of like playful thing, like, it almost feels like the way you would play with like a lover or play with a partner, and you'd say, like, now you have a beard and play guitar. Like it's very sweet, it's very lovely, and does so much work because we've gone from microscopic dot to like a real person that looks a certain way and does a certain thing. So it's a very, very nice moment. And yeah, I think that that is definitely kind of the moment where we're really going into a deeper place. And I also think that another moment where I felt like we kind of, it's not the turn in the poem, but it is kind of a moment where I kind of felt like I could see this poem like I could see the kind of, I don't know, outline of a door. Like when it's dark and then so there's a light on in the hallway and you see the outline of the door. I feel like I saw the outline of the door in this moment where she says, remember so and so. And there's something really striking about that because it's like, who is this so and so? And unlike in other moments of the poem where we're kind of left out of the specifics, I do, which I'm kind of okay with. I'm like, okay, I don't maybe need to know what happened and then ended, what else happened and then, forgot what came before. I do kind of want to know what that so and so is. And there's something really nice and human about that. Like there's this moment of like real connection. And I think what's really powerful about it is like we really don't have, other than, the horse, really, this is the first moment there's any indication of any character or any other person existing in the poem. And so bringing in that connection, I think is really, really beautiful. And using the phrase so and so, like having a beautiful kind of lyrical poem and not being afraid to say things very colloquial, like, oh, so and so is really, really nice. And that we always have that at our disposal. Um, and I do think it's, important to note that like we're not talking about adding in a cliche, right? Because she could have just said, "Remember that person whose name I forgot," or "Remember that she's not using it because it's like this is a natural way to say this. It's not because she didn't have other language at her disposal. Like this just feels the most natural way to say what she wants to say here. Um, and it's beautiful. And then it's also, the first question in the poem, and she's able to ask the next question. Remember when it used to rain in winter? Like there's this longing and nostalgia without her ever saying the words like longing and nostalgia, by pulling in these really lovely details. Um, and this flipping of I feel like this poem is very much like a collage where she has these like beautiful nature details. And if you've read Danusha's work, she's brilliant at describing things in nature. But she also has this fun way of like bringing it into the not a rejection of the pastoral, but almost like a revamping of the pastoral, where she's got this remember when you wore your hair short, dyed pink, pierced your ears all the way up to the rim? Like she's not afraid to juxtapose like a beautiful, like we've got the underbelly of sky and apple cores and, horses. And then she's like, and then here's this like very real moment. And that kind of, I think, is what makes the poem feel really fresh and unique, is she's not just staying with one thing. Um, I think one thing that we can do in our own work, which I do a lot, like I have very unglamorous. I wish I could say it was a notebook, but it's not. It's just a notes app on my phone. But I have like a poetry pantry of just details. Not like ideas for poems, but literally just details. Like if I see someone on the street wearing something that I'm like, I don't know anything about that person. I probably am not going to write about that specific person, but I want to write about, their purple boots that lace up to the top. That might be a detail that I'm gonna throw into a poem somewhere. Or, you know, someone who's got, places a cabbage, on the placing a cabbage on a conveyor belt, like completely devoid of any meaning, just having this like running list, and you don't have to know where you're going to use it. I think that that's what's really powerful to pull on, is these like details that you don't really know why, but there's something like, someone in front of me puts a cabbage on a conveyor belt. Maybe that will go into a poem. Maybe I'm gonna use, remember when it used to rain in winter? Like that's kind of sounds like something that someone might say offhanded to you, and you don't know, like you're probably not immediately have a poem built around it, but you're like, that's something that I kind of, so paying attention to dialogue and paying attention to images that we can use in our poems that we don't know where they're going to go or what the purpose is, or, and it can also be a really great way if you want to write about something, and another way that a poetry pantry can be really useful is if you want to write about something, but you want to change enough details so that whatever the situation you're writing about is, like, if it's uncomfortable or maybe there's like some ethical reason you don't want to like, you know, include all the real details, you can use this to kind of build like a fake set around like whatever you want to talk about. So you're like, oh, I don't want this person to know that I'm writing about them. So I'm going to set it, here instead of here. And I'm going to use these fake details. And then just kind of, I'm going to tell that story, but, disguised in so much layering that, they'll never know that I was writing about them. That's another kind of secret little way to kind of do that. And also, it can open up writer's block if you're ever having trouble discussing something. And maybe it's because you're trying to keep it in the exact scenario that it was in. And if you change enough details, that might be a way to approach that topic um, in a new way. So that's just a kind of side thing. But yeah, I think that this poem is really beautiful in that it really is like kind of just following thoughts. It's not following a major event. I don't know how she got to the turn. I don't know if this was just something that this is what sparked the idea for the poem. Like, I mean, we'll never know. Like, she could have originally started the poem with, Today I walked down the beach holding hands, and decided to build the poem up from there. And she knew where it was kind of gonna, oh, I didn't mean to do that. But or maybe she created this whole little list, like maybe she had this idea to start a poem with because something happens, then ends, and then got to the end and was, kind of waited for something else to kind of fill that place. But I think that's really an example of how we have to like trust where things are going and be okay with not knowing, and being okay with anything can go there. I think that has a lot to do with what I'm talking about, is like anything can go anywhere. You play and you see what the poem wants, and it's okay not to know. Like this is quite a big jump from the poem that she set up, and she potentially had no idea that this is where it was going to go. Maybe she got up from her desk and left this poem on her computer or in her notebook or wherever she writes her poem, and then went on a walk and then just added and realized this is where the poem was going. Or maybe she used her little poetry pantry of notes and was like, oh, remember that time I was on the beach? And that's what if I put that there? Or maybe she tried multiple examples. So I think that that's kind of when we're talking about like where the invisible door is, like there's never going to be a right answer. But I think every answer is worth trying. And that's really like where the play of poetry comes in is like never say, no, we can't do that, oh, that might be too much, just try it because it's so successful here and it's very surprising. And I don't think that there would have been a prescriptive way for her to get from point A to point B. Like she couldn't have tried it until she tried it. There's no rule that says, you should turn a kind of like lyrical musings poem with a bunch of questions to a narrative. Like that's not a thing that someone would say, oh, it works every time, but it worked here. So I think that that's really, really useful when we're talking about that invisible door. Any other thoughts on this poem before we move on? Okay, we shall move on to, that poem is in Danusha's newest book, Blade by Blade. It just came out. I highly recommend it for anyone looking for I'm always recommending poetry books. That one is definitely worth picking up, as are all of Danusha's books, but it's lovely. And this is from, actually, I'm not sure if this is from Dorian's newest book. I don't remember, but everything Dorian writes is also fabulous. I love all these poets, and we can gush about that. Also, I'm very open to just, discussing these poets in general because where poems fall on in a poet's like larger body of work is also like a very interesting discussion, I think, especially for poets who've had like in particular Dorian, who has a lot of books out. Like I do think it's very interesting because I think sometimes we conflate voice, like a poet's voice, with like it has to be this way. And many, many poets don't do that and they very much have a voice. Um, but I think we can feel like, oh, no, I can't write like this because all of my successful poems have been this exact way. And that's very much not true. We can try anything, and there are ways to bring in your own unique perspective and your own unique voice into that. And you see that, I think, more with poets who have many books out because they're given the opportunity to really play. And very much I see their voice throughout that. So I'm definitely interested if anyone, has any questions about that. We can discuss that. But do I have any volunteers to read Fig by Dorian Lux?
I would like to.
Go ahead.
Okay, Fig. Now that I'm old, I'm trying to stay focused on my feet, trying not to trip so I won't break a hip, end up in a hospital surrounded by a swarm of nurses and germs, a plastic container of applesauce, a juice box of prunes, bleachy blankets thin as a wish. I don't want to die like this. Kingdom of walls, machines beating, beside me, saints appearing in my peripheral vision, offering to escort me to the final door. I want to die bent to the tide, lifting a shell to my ear, or listening to the duende of the blues on an old record player, tapping the arm to the next groove when it skips. I don't mind becoming fertilizer, that honorable substance. It's not the darkness I fear. It's the bright lights, needles, and ether, the PA system, and the air-conditioned air. I want to die like a criminal in my own provenance, eating the last stolen fig.
Thank you very much. That was a beautiful reading. Any thoughts on this poem?
It's fabulous.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if you could see from the smile on my face. Like I've read this poem probably 100 times, and I'm still smiling as you're reading it. I'm like, oh my God, this poem is so good.
It just puts you right there. And then the language, bleachy blankets, thin as a wish. Wow. Um, yeah, it really does tell the story.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Two
And
stories.
yes, yeah, completely.
I really like the stanza groupings because I think the first one is one, two, three,
Mhm.
four, six six lines, and then it goes into tercets until the end when it's a couplet. So I really
Yeah.
like how usually tercets are like something's off or wrong, and it kind of keeps that until the very end where it's this like acceptance of admitting how you want to go out on your own terms.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
the
and there's
enjambment
something,
and how it just keeps going. Yeah.
yes, I love all these observations. I completely agree. I love a poem that's not afraid to have a break in the, that she didn't force it all into tercets. And it again, a poem where death is such a presence, it makes sense that the final, tercet is missing a line almost. It almost feels like that death is like a presence there, which is lovely. And I think, it can give us that permission to, if something is not working or if like as you mentioned, if our jams are really, really tight and they're really working, maybe the answer is not to try to, go, "Ugh," like we got to make it all into tercets because I've already set up the tercets. Like, it's okay to kind of, go, well, what happens if this stanza doesn't do that, and it could be in a different place in the poem. You often see, poets, I don't think it would work in this poem, but like, she could have like this line be on its own, I want to die bent or something like that. Like she could have played with that and then left everything else, and you have permission to do that. You have permission to play and see, oh, I just messed up the lines. I don't know why there's a space there, but just imagine it gone. But yeah, I think it's really, really beautiful. And it is very, for me, one of the reasons why I like looking at all these poems by all these different poets is because what I'm really trying to say is like you have permission to do all this stuff. You have permission to play. You have permission to sometimes a poem needs to be all in tercets or all in couplets or all in, quatrains or whatever. But sometimes not. And maybe there's a reason. And if you can justify it to yourself, then I think that it can potentially really, really work. And I think she really does a beautiful job of that. And yeah, her enjambments are beautiful. Um, Even like, kind of like more subtle enjambments where she has like saints appearing in my peripheral vision. Like there's a really nice kind of where is that going kind of enjambment, which I think is often overlooked when we talk about enjambment because, you know, there's these like really lovely, where you've got peripheral vision offering to escort me and then to the final door where it kind of works as its own standalone fragment. But there's also that nice, she's not afraid to play with like, anticipation as an enjambment, which is beautiful. And also in a poem about anticipating what comes next, it works very, very well. Um, and we've already talked about this, but the bleachy blankets thin as a wish, I think for me, what's really striking about that line is that she wasn't afraid to say bleachy blankets. She could have just gone blankets thin as a wish, and that would have been lovely, but it kind of would have been like, yeah, okay, like it's pretty, but I could see how it's made. But there's something about like the being unafraid to turn from these kind of like unflattering details, and also to use something playful like bleachy instead of like
Mhm.
bleached blankets. Because there's something like bleachy blankets, like I can almost smell it, whereas bleached blankets kind of doesn't really capture my attention in the same way. I'm like, no, these aren't the blankets that have been bleached one time. Like these are bleachy blankets. They stink like bleach. You can really like it really drops you in and it shows the power of like those details and the power again of that tension that we were talking about of setting something kind of like unappealing next to something lovely, like thin as a wish. Like you kind of have that tension that she really does really beautifully that creates that kind of that truth. I think that's what a lot of these poems do really well is they use kind of beauty and ugliness to create truth. And that's how we kind of step into that place of trust um, with the speaker of these poems. Um, and I mean, I love this poem. I love this moment here where I don't m mind becoming fertilizer, that honorable substance.
Yeah.
It's such a gorgeous line, and you wouldn't like if someone said like the most beautiful line in a poem is gonna have to do with fertilizer. I'd be like, prove it to me. But she does it. She does it, and I believe it. Like I believe when she said, like I believe that this speaker feels this way 100%, and she has me on board because one, because of everything she said above, but also because, there are moments where an adjective does a lot of work, and I think that it's often when an adjective is used in a surprising way. Sometimes we don't need adjectives because, there's a detail that might do more work. But I think when adjectives are doing the most work in a poem is usually when they're used in a very surprising way. Like to describe fertilizer as an honorable substance is really, really striking and really interesting. Like it really it's like it's a very arresting statement. And it's like, well, what does she mean? What is an honorable substance, And it's purposeful, which is, kind of really powerful again in a poem about age and life and what we're doing. And yeah, so I think she's really, really playing with the power of words, which all these poets are doing again and again and again. Um, and there's another moment that I want to talk about, which I see a lot, especially I am an editor, and I see a lot of people are very afraid to repeat words unless it's like, for anaphora or something like that. There's this very deep fear of like repeating a word, and she does it here, and I think it works so well, which is she says, and the air-conditioned air. There's one word in between two airs. And that's such an interesting choice. And you hear it in her words. She's very intentional. She uses rhyme. She's very good at sound. So you know that she didn't do this because she couldn't think of another way to say this. It really creates this poem is really leaving like this plane almost, like with all the air and like, you really feel like the death and the loss and the kind of nextness of where this poem is going by her repeating that. I just think it's brilliant. Like, I think that was such an interesting choice to make in a poem that I think a lot of people would be afraid to do because they'd think like, oh, well, I don't want to say air twice. Um, but I think it's stunning. And then to have conditioned air, I want to die like as a standalone fragment. I always talk about how when you're looking at a line, there's many ways to look at a line. There's like the sentence. There's the line itself, like where it's gonna, start and end with the enjambment. And then there's like the fragment, which is like if Ellen Bass talks about like if your poem gets lost in, hundreds and hundreds of years, like would you have standalone fragments in your poems? And I always think about that when I'm looking at a poem. And I feel like conditioned air, I want to die like is a really, really striking fragment. It feels like, like the way that we have fragments of like Sappho's poetry. It feels very like, ooh, that's really nice. And same with like a criminal in my own provenance is gorgeous, even without that last stunning, like eating the last stolen fig. Obviously, she really brings it home with that. And it's really powerful that she ends on like on an object, a concrete object that's not, she's set up this whole thing. She's got air conditioned air. We're really in the kind of, a criminal in my own provenance. It's an idea where like in this really kind of like heady, ethereal space, and then eating the last stolen fig. Beautiful. Like it's such a lovely way to end it. And again, I think it's that tension, that she creates by contrasting like these kind of ideas with like the real, and it's beautiful. And also stolen fig. I love that it's a stolen fig. Like that's the brilliance of Dorian Lux is that she's, it's not just a fig, it's stolen. Like it's that kind of like I said, kind of using the beauty and the ugly. Not that the word stolen is ugly, but just that kind of like something nice with something kind of, naughty and that kind of creating that tension to create something that feels very true. Which I think is lovely and all the poets do very well. Any other thoughts on this poem?
That last line to me, the word provenance struck me, and I had to pause for a moment. In fact, I just looked it up. I wanted to see something about the word itself. But to be a criminal in your own beginnings is what it from the beginning, knowing that that's a part of you and that you're eating a stolen fig is to me uh, is not the darkness. It's an acceptance of your own uh,
Mhm.
nature, I think is what I'm trying to say. And I like that because that line before there is everything you don't want. It's not the darkness that you fear, it's all these other these all systematic, um, hospital-like bright lights, engineered death, where you really want to die as you are. And I like that it brings it back to that. Slightly criminal in your own truth.
I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's something really lovely about the way she's like reclaiming something that's very it's almost like a reclaiming of an internal state. Like despite the fear of like all this stuff, she knows what she wants or the speaker knows what they want. Um and
Still an
it
honorable substance, so it's
mhm.
honorable because it's who you are.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
she kind of brings it back to that, and I like that a lot.
Yeah, and I like that she's not afraid to go back and forth. Like it's not that that's the other thing that I think is important to note when you make a turn, you don't that doesn't mean you have to stay in one kind of line of thinking. Like she has the I don't mind becoming fertilizer, that honorable substance. Okay, so she's making like an internal claim. It feels very powerful. And then she talks about fear, like it's very honest. It's not like saying what I think she could have potentially gone from I don't mind becoming fertilizer, that honorable substance. I want to die like a criminal in my own provenance, eating the last stolen fig. That's it still would have been a beautiful poem. But there's something so honest about the going to the it's not the darkness I fear, it's the bright lights, needles and ether. Like there's something really nice about, and she's not afraid to do that. She's not afraid to go, I've made this statement and it's powerful, and this, and then and back to this. Like there's not this like I can only stay in one tone now. And I think that that's really where we build a trust with our readers is where we're not trying to say things only in one tone. That's why I think there's something very like um appealing about moments in I always talk about the moment in Good Will Hunting where the therapist is talking about like the wife farting. And it's like that kind of that way of thing. And everyone who's seen that movie is nodding their head because you all know what I'm talking about. The reason why that moment is so powerful is because it's not afraid to like get real and you trust how much that character loves you know, their departed wife. That moment you're building trust with your audience because you're telling something and it's the fact that they're saying it in this moment all these years later. It's not like, oh, I loved the way, she looked when she was, coming out of the pool or I don't know, like something kind of like you're like, okay, yeah, well, like, I that wouldn't build trust with me, but that why that moment is so powerful is because it's such a real moment and it's not afraid to show love through this surprising angle. And I think that, anytime we're showing any sort of truth, like we need not be afraid of showing something through an unflattering angle and trusting that the reader will go along with it. Like if you say it the way you want to say it, like you can trust us. Like I don't think that the only thing this poem is thinking about, I mean, this speaker is thinking about is this fear. This, speaker is so much more than this fear. However, they're not hiding it from you. And I think that that's where you build that trust. You can make these statements and include like, and sometimes I'm not sure, or sometimes I think about this, and you can contradict yourself in a poem. You can introduce good and bad in a poem. You could, you know, have something kind of ugly in a poem, and it doesn't mean that the poem won't be beautiful. It doesn't mean that the poem, won't resonate. And I think it's really not being afraid to do those things, and even maybe trying to look for those things to create that trust. Because that's the moment where I think I often find myself going, "Oh, I trust this speaker. They know what they're doing. They're not afraid to show me this. They're trusting that I, as a reader, am intelligent enough and am feeling enough to know." Like when they wrote that line for Good Will Hunting, they weren't going, well, they're going to think he doesn't really love his his wife, right? Like they know that they know that, and you know that. And so I think that when you're writing a poem, trying to think of those details that really, I call them like the the intimate details that only being close to someone or something or some idea or whatever would allow you to tell. Those are kind of the ideas those are the kind of details that I think are really, really powerful. Um, if you've ever read the poem Hurry by Marie Howe, which I share constantly, I've shared it with like everyone. She has the detail of like the socks being rolled down and like, these things that only it's about a mother and a daughter, and only a mother would like notice those kind of details, and that creates that intimacy rather than saying like my daughter looked so beautiful, she hadn't, you know the eyes of a field, no, she's like the socks are rolled down. I'm like, only a mom would be like, oh, the jacket's open and the socks are rolled down. Like that's a mom detail, and it creates that intimacy without ever telling. I know that this speaker cares about this kid because they noticed something like that. Sometimes the act of noticing creates more intimacy than like trying to beautify something, because you would only notice that if you were that close to someone. Um, so yeah, and that's also something to note when we're trying to fill our little poetry pantries of details, or like what are details that only being this, like if for instance, and this is not just to do with, relationships. If you're talking about a job, what does the back room look like? What does the inside of the cash register look like? Like, is there a little rubber band that no one has ever taken out of that cash register? Like, those are the kind of details that show me that this speaker is in it. Like, these are things that I'm not privy to. I don't have that information. I don't work at that cash register in that particular store. Like, tell me those details. Like, show me that you're deep in something. What is the do you have a locker? Do you have these things? What's in the locker? Who's next to you? These tiny, or is there a sticker that's been there for 40 years and you don't know the story behind this sticker, but you see it every single day? Like those are the kind of details that create that intimacy that let me know that like, oh, this is how deep this particular moment goes. And so yeah. So that's definitely something to note when we're talking about the poetry pantry. Like it can be very, very easy to just include like the most, kind of surface level details, but noticing the little things I think is where you really kind of get into like that juice of, those really striking details. Any other thoughts on this poem before we move on? And if I'm going like too fast or anyone wants me to repeat anything, also, feel free to let me know. I'm Italian, I talk very quickly. I talk with my hands. I go, and I get very excited about poems that I like. So, do I have any volunteers for the next poem? Elizabeth, I think you
Oh,
need,
sorry,
yeah,
sorry, I
yeah,
had
thank you.
on mute button. Sorrow is not my name, after Gwendolyn Brooks. No matter the pull towards brink, no matter the florid deep sleep awaits. There is a time for everything. Look, just this morning a vulture nodded his red grizzled head at me, and I looked at him, admiring the sickle of his beak. Then the wind kicked up, and after arranging that good suit of feathers, he up and took off, just like that. And to boot, there are on this planet alone something like 2 million naturally occurring sweet things, some with names so generous as to kick the steel from my knees. Agave, persimmon, stickball, the purple okra I bought for $2 at the market. Think of that. The long night, the skeleton in the mirror, the man behind me on the bus taking notes. Yeah, yeah. But look, my niece is running through a field calling my name. My neighbor sings like an angel, and at the end of my block is a basketball court. I remember my color's green. I'm spring for Walter Aikens.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts on this poem? Good.
I live next door to a guy who won Canadian Idol in like 2008, and he really does sing like an angel. But he also has music students or singing students who sing differently.
So I want to talk about that moment in particular because I think in most poems or most workshops, this line would get cut,
Mm.
right? You'd be like, you can't say you would at least say you got to edit that line. Like that would be the kind of standard, like my neighbor sings like an angel. I'd be like, that's a little cliche. We need to change that. Um, and the reason why I think it works here is because look at all that we've established. This poet is not leaning into cliches in any way. When they come to this line, my neighbor sings like you believe it. You're like, if you're describing your neighbor singing like an angel, like you obviously, because you have the language at like, and that this is kind of where there are moments where you can get away with things in poems if you've done all the other work. And I think that it's actually like a really brilliant line in that like we have all these really unique turns of phrase, like arranging that good suit of feathers. Like it's really kind of like lovely and specific and everything. And then when they like sings like an angel, it almost feels like there's no other way to describe the way the neighbor sings because you've seen it. This poet can do it. They can describe things. Like they've got the language, like no matter the florid deep sleep awaits. Like, so when you get to that, you're like, I believe you. This neighbor probably does sing like an angel. Um, so I think that there are moments where breaking the rules is okay. And I think that that's again, like I'm very interested in where things can't be prescriptive. Like you can't say it'll never ever work because there are always moments. You know, we've got soul, which I know is like often discouraged in poems in the Alison Luterman poem, and I think it works brilliantly. You know, there are so many moments where things work, and I think the reason that they work is because of all the other work of all the other lines. And I don't want this line to be something else. Like I'm not going, oh, I wish that, you know, there was a more poetic way. No, because maybe there's not. Like maybe that's truly when you hear this neighbor singing, that is how you feel. And also, I think it really sets up the next line. My neighbor sings like an angel, and at the end of my block is a basketball court. The fact that that's where the line goes is really interesting because it feels like, in terms of like building in a poem, Normally, you would think it would be the other way around. Like at the end of my block is a basketball court and my neighbor sings like an angel. But by putting that line there, we know that this basketball court means something to this speaker. You kind of build an intimacy with this speaker. You're like, okay, this is what's important to them. And I think that that can give us permission, like, if you're describing something and you like something, but it's not kind of like what most people would go on to describe. Like maybe you really like, I don't know, like you really like the cereal aisle in the grocery store and not like I don't know, like kids, playing a game, in the frozen food aisle or something. You know what I mean? Like what's important to you is okay if you can show the reader, if you can convey that to the reader and make them trust you. You don't always have to like lean onto the kind of more obvious moments they can be in the poem, but you're also allowed to be like, this is where my attention goes. And that I think is really where voice is built in a poem. You can often tell, like when you read a body of work by a poet, like what are they looking at? What are they noticing? And it's okay. And when you notice that about yourself, I think that's where like your poetry really starts to take off. The poet Mark Doty calls this your perceptual signature. And it's like, what are you noticing when you walk into a space? What are you noticing when you're writing a poem? What are the details and the turns of phrase and the things that you really like? And I think when you can really hone in on that, like that's where you kind of find that really unique thing that makes your work yours. And you can really hear it in a lot of, great poets' work. Like what are the things that they notice? Are you noticing the birds? Are you noticing the clothing? Are you noticing the way things sound? Are you really like always have details about sound? Like if particularly if you're a musician and you're writing, about a scene, like, and you do notice things, like I wouldn't necessarily notice like all the sound in something, but I want to know if that is something you notice, put that in a poem. So I think that that's kind of where you're allowed to put emphasis where you want the emphasis to be. Like it doesn't have to be like what you've seen in other poems. Um, and yeah, I think this is a really, really beautiful poem. I love the command. I love a command in a poem, especially like when it's kind of surprising, like the look. Just this morning, a vulture, like this kind of like one, it's kind of like casual, like in saying like, look, I just, saw this morning, but there's also where the line is in jammed, it's telling us to look, and that's a really nice moment because we're like, oh, we should be looking, shouldn't we? So it's just a really beautiful moment. And I think we can be, you know, we have permission to do that in a poem, to like really give our readers a command because we're in control or our speaker is in control. And I think that that can be a kind of, I think that this feels kind of like what I was talking about. Like the door is kind of, you can kind of see the outline of the door of where this poem is going in this moment where we're being told to look. Um, and yeah, that's an option. One of the many options, as we've seen in all the poems, is to like maybe where your poem needs to go a little deeper, maybe you need to tell the reader to do something, something that has meant something to you. Like, here, look at this thing, or here, go and do this thing, or, whatever. Like, I think that's kind of one of the many, many, many options we have when we want our poems to go deeper. And to not be afraid of that, like, that authority. I think our speakers sometimes we are afraid to have our speakers be like such an authority, and it's okay to let them have that authority when they're speaking. Uh, and I just love, I mean, I think this poem is like absolutely stunning and the way like this nice little, one of my favorite enjambments in all the poems that we've looked at today is there are on this planet alone something like 2 in jam million. Like that's really, really beautiful in jam. Like that's so fun. And, this poet, Ross Gay, was not afraid to let this line go on. Like this is well, I don't know if it is longer than the line angel, but it's one of the longest lines in the poem. Um, and it works. I think it 100% works because it's like there are on this planet alone something like two like this sentence is really building. Like we're going, okay, where are we going? Um, and it just works so brilliantly to have this like two and then million. Like it just feels like for me, that's like a real moment where you almost feel that door opening on the poem. You're like 2 million. Like we are going really big. We have this really specific image of the vulture. Um, and we spend so much time with this vulture. And then we have and just like, and he just took off just like that. And to boot, and it really goes like out. And that's kind of where we really feel it. And we feel it just from the end jam, really. Like, in my opinion, like, I feel like that end jam is doing so much work, you know, um, in a really playful way, too. It almost feels like a little gotcha kind of moment. And I just think it's stunning. Um, And just like again with the details, like we've got in this little list that we've got, and also this is another option. I see this a lot in poems where um when it comes to lists, like we're maybe afraid to go on too long. And I think it's okay if all the items in the list are doing enough work. And I think in this case, well, Roske is a brilliant poet, so there's not much that he could do that wouldn't work. But in this case, like agave, persimmon, stickball, the purple okra I bought for $2 at the market. I think that kind of like that really taking the time with the list, and to kind of again, this feels kind of similar to the something like 2 million naturally occurring sweet things, where it kind of plays with like your expectations. We have agave and persimmon. To me, these are like poetry kind of details, like it's agave and persimmon. You know what I mean? Like I'm could probably find a bunch of poems with agave and persimmon in it. But then we've got stickball, purple okra, not just any purple okra, the purple okra I bought for $2 at the market. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And because it feels real and it's this kind of grounding of these details, these super, super vibrant details, and then they're grounded. Like I don't want it like I noted. Okay, so for an example, like if you're going to use like cicadas in your poem, like where are the cicadas? Like that's used in so many poems, and I'm not saying never to put a cicada in your poem, but show me the moment. Give me that $2 moment in your poem. Like bring it so I know it's you writing it, or I know it's the speaker saying it. What I think that that's kind of like a thing that I'm always looking for when we're using kind of more conventional details is like, what is the thing that makes this like, I believe that this speaker experienced this thing and noticed it in this moment, not like they got stuck and then pulled from like the common poetry word bank. Um, Dorian Lux has many, many poems about the moon, and they're all brilliant. And she, again, like the moon is kind of a more common topic. And I think the way that she tackles it in a fresh way each time is she really plays with like never using conventional language to describe it. Like she has a line like the toilet paper moon. Like she really is playing. And to not be afraid to like play, to give yourself permission to use things that maybe you've seen in poems or maybe you've been told, oh, don't write about that. Write about it, but see how you can kind of put your own little twist on it. How you can, use your specific example of something so that I go, oh, only you could have written that line. Which I think Roske does so, so, so brilliantly. Any other thoughts on this poem? Also, any questions? Like, I'm totally cool with taking questions on any of these poems. Okay. Do we want to move on to the next poem? Do I have any volunteers to read this poem? And if not, I'm totally happy to read it. Okay, I'm gonna read this one. Eggplant. I loved the white moon circles and the purple halos on a plate as the salt sweat them. The oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert when a moon stayed all day, when morning was a purple elegy for the last friend seen. When the fog of the riverbank rose like a holy ghost, my mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. Some parsley appeared from the garden in summer evenings, came with no memory but the table with white dishes, shining aubergine, black-skinned beauty, bitter apple. We used our hands. Any thoughts on this poem?
The Syrian desert, that brings in a lot of unspoken associations of like war, terrorism, refugees, displacement. Like, unfortunately, these concepts are just tied to the country of Syria. So it puts us into a puts us in a dark place.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually heard Peter Balakian speak about this poem, and that is
Yeah, I don't know what
definitely
it's
like that.
about, but it's what I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah, exactly. But I think you're 100% right in that this is a poem where really just giving us a little does so much. Like we have the days in the Syrian desert, and we can be given so much context or so much like, which again I think is done in a really interesting way because I think like this poem could have easily like that could have been and now we're really gonna, talk about, the effects of, war and everything. And that would have been a, a powerful option. But we also don't have to. Like sometimes if we need that context, we don't always have to like we can be like, okay, and here's like kind of the situation, like the overarching, thing that's going on with the significance of these details, but we don't necessarily need to go into it. And I think that that's really, really powerful in the way that like we can kind of touch on something just to give it's almost like in a poem about food, it's almost like just a pinch of salt. It's like, okay, here we go. Like this is you need to know this because this is why it's significant. This is why these details are significant, but that's not what this particular poem is about. And so I just want you to know that. And I think it's like a really, really like sign of a skilled poet where you need to drop in that information and you're able to do it so quickly if you don't want to keep going. And I think like again, I think it could have worked either way. I think the poem could have definitely gone darker there, but I also think that it works the way it is. And I I think we're given just enough information right there in that moment where I'm like, oh, okay. Thank you. I'm glad to know this. Um, and also like it's such a brilliant simile. Like the oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert. Like the simile does so much work and it's so haunting because you immediately know that like we're talking about food, but we're not talking about food. We're talking about the significance of these meals and the significance of like particular dishes, and it's just done so brilliantly and so quickly. I think that that's like really a skill that takes a lot of work is when you want to put something in a poem and you don't want to dwell there. It's like how fast can I say this thing that the reader needs to know without dwelling in it because here's where the poem that I want to write actually lives. Um, and yeah, simile can be a really, I think, striking way to do that. I think when we talk about like what when similes really work, and I think it's when they really work is like this detail needed to be in this poem. This is like essential to understanding like the emotional undercurrent of this poem. And it's striking. Like it's really, really striking because we have like, we're talking about food. We've got basically, 4 lines really where we're just kind of in the description of the food. And to then kind of go there, it feels like earned because it's a simile. So we're like, okay, well, now we're describing what this is like, and we're getting that emotional context. So I think that that's an option for our similes is like, if you come to a place in a poem, you're like, oh, I think a simile would be really useful here. You get to that moment like the oil in the pan smoked like, which I think a lot of times when we're writing poems, we do get those moments where like, I feel like I want to go more into like what this was like is can I use like this simile as an opportunity to give greater context to the poem or give greater context to the type of speaker this is or, what the speaker would think of. Like if I'm writing a poem, me personally, if I'm writing a poem about oil in the pan, smoked like I'm not going to write like bad days in the Syrian desert because that's not my experience. Like I would never think to write that, but I think that's like, what would you put there? And I think sometimes it can be an interesting exercise to pull out the similes and just kind of as a fun writing exercise to pull out all the similes in a poem and think of like, what would I write there? Like, what would I put there that is related to my experience? Okay, so like I'm writing about smoke in the pan. What is related to my experience that would fit here? Like, how could I let the reader know? And it can kind of be a nice exercise to kind of practice that specificity with our similes. Like, how can I make sure that my similes have maximum emotional impact and feel true? Because sometimes I think things will be compared to things, and I'm like, is it really like that? But and I'm going, I don't know. Or it's like, or maybe it's overly beautiful, and I'm like, I don't really need this moment to be beautiful because the details to me are beautiful. Like, especially in this poem, like we've got white moon circles and purple halos. I'm like, that's a cool way to describe cutting an eggplant, like the way an eggplant looks. Like I wouldn't have thought to look at an eggplant that way. Um, and then as the salt sweat them, again, that's cool. Like I would never have thought to describe an eggplant in this way. And but we've got all these cool lines. We've got all these cool details. Like, do we need to keep going? And in this case, yes, because now we're getting into like and I think that that's can be useful in our poems. Like if we've done the work, like we've done we've got beautiful descriptions or specific descriptions and stuff, and then you get to a moment in a poem, you're like, I want to keep going here. What is the option? Maybe the option is I need to go deeper, not more beautiful, but deeper. And I think that can be really, really super, super, super useful. Um, because I think oftentimes our impulse is to go more beautiful or to go dark, but maybe not dark in a way that's giving any other context to the poem. So I think that like kind of going, how can I just go in? Like I want the reader to know this speaker in this moment and kind of using that simile as a way of doing that. Um, and again, we've got this repetition, which I think works really well and doesn't feel like on the nose or like really super intentional. Like I honestly, I don't think I noticed this the first time I read this poem. Like we've got moon and moon. And it's not over the top. It's not like, oh man, this is a moon poem, It's very subtle and it works, because it's almost going, hey, I remember this moon. I remember these memories, these days in the Syrian, like it's almost like kind of haunting in a way, which you don't often see the moon used in kind of a really haunting sort of way. At least I don't see that as much. And it's like, oh no, when I said I loved the white moon circles, like it kind of takes on another meaning. When you reread it, you're like, oh, when a moon stayed all day. And there's also like it's not just the moon, it's the moon that stayed all day. Again, it's like the using the specificity to really draw us in, which I think is really, really And then we get it again. My mother made those white moons sizzle. And again, I still don't, because it's done with so many details in between, I don't really feel like I'm being manipulated or I'm being like forced into this really like poemy sort of language because it also just feels like my mother made those white moons. It also feels kind of accurate. And I think that's like the power of accuracy. Like I can see these white moons sizzling and I don't feel distracted because it's done so quickly. It's like, okay. And I think that that's where a lot of this poem really kind of strikes me as really effective is that this poem knows how to be concise. It knows how to drop something and then not stay there because we don't need to. Like we've done the work. Um, and I think that's it's so difficult, but it can be really, really useful, especially if, you get to the end of the poem and you feel like you've made that discovery, you've figured out where you want your poem to go, and you don't want to fill it with stuff. Sometimes like then rather than adding details is how can I make stuff so concise that this poem doesn't need to go on any longer than it needs to, which I think this poem really, really does well. And it's not afraid to repeat itself. We've got salt and salt, you know, uh, this poem is not concerned with, we've got the white moon, the white dishes. And again, like obviously the white dishes feel like an echo of a white moon. And this poet is not at all afraid to do those things. So I think that there's also, again, like I'm talking a lot about permission, but I do think it needs to be stated often because I do think we often hear like, don't do this and don't do that and don't do this and don't do that. But I do think there's always examples where it works and understanding why it works. And also it can be useful for you when you're reading a poem. If you come across a poem and it does something that you really like, it's useful to ask yourself why. Like how is this poet able to pull this off? Like why does this work so well? Um, because I think that that's how we really like learn and kind of build our like, you know, our toolbox of things that are working. Um, and then we've got this really kind of, I think it's kind of clever where we've got the shining aubergine, and it could have been like shining moon, but no, like we're going back to the real, like, oh yeah, no, we're talking about an eggplant. And that's kind of like it's lovely. And then you've got like the bitter apple again. You've got that tension between like something not as sweet with something kind of like lovely or resonant, and apple's like obviously got a lot of metaphoric resonance and
Garden of Eden.
yeah, exactly. So like you've got this thing, but it doesn't even need to be said in this poem, which I love. Like I love that we're not going, hey, you know that apple? Apple's that thing that we all write poems about, Like it's very quick. This poet really knows how to do that. And it doesn't need like we've got Holy Ghost like in this poem. Like we know this poet understands religious significance, right? Like you don't always need to say it. You can let something do the work and never say it. Like I have a poem recently that I got an email about, and it was about, there's a lot of all of my a lot of my poems have religious undertones, but there was elephants in the poem, and someone was saying like, oh, well, did you consider like, other religions like Hinduism or, Ganesh and stuff like that when you were writing that? And I said I did, but I thought that I would just because that's not something that I feel equipped enough to speak on. I didn't feel like I wanted to kind of write about it. But I did feel like if someone were to make that connection, it would be, it would only deepen their experience of that poem. And that's kind of an example of like, I could have gone, oh, and hey, there's this thing, but I didn't need to do that. Like you can let an image be an image, like in here with the apple, like we could go to Eden here, but we don't need to. Like we can let people who make that, like the line works with or without that reference. And so, we don't always need to, and it could be for multiple reasons. Like for my reason in my poem was that I just didn't feel like equipped to speak on that. But I did think it was interesting that I've got this poem with religious imagery in it, and then we've got elephants, which also have like, significance. And but I just didn't feel the need to say that. So I think that there's also like that playing with, you can put an image in your poem and not necessarily explain it as long as it works. Like if the line can be read on its own with or without the other context, I think that's where it can really work. Um, and yeah, I think this is, and I love this ending. I really find this to be such a striking kind of powerful ending. It reminds me a lot of the Dorian Lux poem, with this kind of like indulgence and this kind of like power, like, and also, I think this is the only moment in the poem where we have a we. Yeah, it is. It is the only moment in the poem we have a we. And there's something really, really powerful about that. Like you're allowed to make that switch. Like we have I, we have, we do have another character, we have the mother. But then to make that switch at the end, it feels like, to me, this is the invisible door in the poem, is the we. We're really talking about like community and like what brings us together. And so that's something we can all do in our poems. Like if we get stuck, like what happens if I switch here? If I was using a we, what if I switched I? If I was using a you, what if I switched to we? What if like you can really try that in your poems and see what happens, like see where that, and it doesn't necessarily, I'm not talking about a last line, I'm talking about any point in your poem. You can use that as a way of kind of switching, and not switching the whole poem. You can leave what you have written if you like it and see what happens. Does it open a door? Because I think here it really does. Like this matters. And I think to me, that's what this line is saying, is like, this matters. This detail matters. The fact that we ate this matters. This history matters. And like that kind of like doubling down on that idea is really, really, really striking. And also like to end on such kind of a simple statement, like we used our hands, like it's very simple. But obviously with all the other context that we have, it really lands. Um, But yeah, I think it's really, really beautiful. Any thoughts on this poem or questions or anything? I will say that one thing that because I do like to point out like where I question things in poems, not that I think it's wrong because it didn't pull me out at all. But the first couple times I read it, I was like, why are there so many M dashes? Like, like what's going on here? Because anytime I like a poem, I do also want to question things because I want to understand it. Because I've never done this in a poem, and I don't know that I ever will. I mean, maybe, but there's a lot of M dashes. Like this feels like Emily Dickinson core. Like this feels like very like, okay, why are we what's going on here? Why so many M dashes? Um, and I was thinking about it because for me, like, I'm always I love punctuation. I think punctuation is very interesting in poems because it can do different things. And I will also say that when it comes to voice, you'll notice that certain poets use, yeah, I mean, I made a joke about Emily Dickinson because that's a very obvious one, but um, different poets will use different punctuation in different ways. Like the reason someone might use an em dash in one poem could be very different than why someone else would use an em dash in another poem. Like they might want a particular type of pause, and that might not be at all the reason why another poet is using it or how another poet would read it. Like the way I read this poem is not necessarily how the poet would read this poem, um, or how they intended those em dashes to be read, but we'll just never know. But I do think it's very, very interesting to have all these em dashes, especially because what I find really particularly interesting, kind of my understanding of like why maybe there's all these em dashes is um which I'm very interested if anyone has any other ideas because I don't have a definitive answer. But we've got, the first one is here. The first one is right after this simile that really deepens the poem, and then it's this em dash, and it's kind of like out, you know. And then when a moon stayed all day. Again, it feels out, kind of feels like left off, like the em dashes are kind of leaving us like, ooh. And then we have the next line, and then we have elegy for the last friend seen. So there's really these em dashes are doing the work of memory, and creating this feeling of like, you know, these are images, but they're kind of they're out, they're not recent. They feel, kind of, almost like reaching out, like an arm reaching for something and not grasping it. And then we've got this beautiful moment of the M dash, and it is connected to something, which feels like a echo of where the poem goes with the we.
It
Like
also
this,
feels like slicing to me, like the eggplant has to be sliced into these moons.
yes.
But it's
I
like,
yes, I 100% agree. I do feel like they can be read as like this slicing. Um And I think that, like, again, I think that's like the power of like also like looking at something. I always talk about like what does something look like visually, especially with punctuation, because I think it's very interesting to think about like what it looks like on the page and to have all these kind of like, whether it be knives or arms reaching out, to have this kind of like thing that you see when just by looking at the poem, if this poem was in another language and you couldn't read it, but you saw these M dashes, like you'd kind of feel that sense of like longing or not having something, but you would see this one down here, the last M dash of the poem that is connected to a word. And you'd kind of feel that kind of visual symmetry that matches the ending line without ever really knowing it. It feels very much like we used our hand. It feels like the hand is finally grasping onto something here, which I think is really, really striking and kind of something to think about with, how intentional we are with our punctuation, because I think it is really, really important. Um, and th this poet really kind of has, I mean, I guess they don't use colons or anything, but they've got commas, they've got periods, they've got em dashes. They're using everything. And that also shows me that they know what they're doing, right? Like the first line after halos is not an em dash. It could have been because we've got a comma. So we know that there's some sort of pause that's meant to go there beyond the pause of the line break. Um, but not putting that there, I think, is a very interesting choice. And again, it kind of it's thinking about like why that is and where the intention is. And I feel like when I look really deeply at this poem, I feel like it is justified, even though I didn't initially understand it, and I maybe wouldn't have done this if I was writing this poem, but I do understand it, and I feel like it's really clever and really kind of bold to do that, especially like I don't know, I feel like, em dashes are used quite sparingly and probably for a good reason, but I do think that this is a really bold and effective choice here. We didn't need all these M dashes, but I'm glad that they're there. I'm glad that like they made me think about it. Um, and there's also something kind of like haunting about the before the penultimate M dash. Um, my mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. I really like that penultimate one because it feels both like the way that the M dash is in the beginning, we're kind of like drawing our attention to like these memories of the Syrian desert where the moon stayed all day, the elegy for the last one. And there's kind of set, but then it's like this too also is not really in my grasp either. Both the Syrian desert and this act of like these eggplants being cooked doesn't, it also feels there in that space too, which I think is really, really powerful. And that it's kind of saved for this moment in the poem is really, really striking and kind of haunting and sad and all that just from a punctuation mark, it kind of goes, oh, this too is, not within my grasp at the moment. So I think it's really, really a beautiful choice. Any other thoughts on this poem? any questions? I'm always open for questions because I might not have the answer, but I do like to think about why. Like I said, I definitely questioned myself about the M dashes when I was reading this poem.
I think that's fantastic. I do think like most of the people left because I did this at 3 o'clock, so sorry.
Oh, I'm a half hour over.
So yeah. That's I think we have one more. Oh,
Yeah,
all right, yeah, if you wanna, I think it's just pretty much Elizabeth and I now left. So
that's fine. I'm so sorry. I did not real. Oh, okay, good. We have a couple of people. Um, yeah, I'm so sorry. I hope it makes up for the fact that I was late. So I'm
no,
like,
it's very
okay.
informative. Thank you.
Yeah. And also too, I guess you said it's being recorded. So if people can't, go, they get the rest of it. Okay. Okay. I will say this is one of my favorite poems of all time, like full stop. I have like four poems and they're my favorite favorites. This is one of them. I do have it memorized, so I can read it without looking at it. But if anyone else would like to read it and experience it for the first time, if you haven't already read it, go for it. If not, I'm happy to read it. Okay, I will read it. The swan at Edgewater Park isn't one of your prissy rich people's swans. Wouldn't be caught on some pristine pond, chooses the whole stinking shoreline, candy wrappers, condoms in its tidal fringe. Prefers to curve its muscular, slightly grubby neck into the body of a great lake, swilling whatever it is swans swill, chardonnay of algae with bouquet of crud. While Clevelanders walk by saying, "Look at that big duck." Beauty isn't the point here, of course. The swan isn't beautiful. The swan is beautiful, but not like Lori at 16 when everything was possible. No, more like Lori at 27, smoking away her days off in her dirty kitchen, her kid with asthma watching TV, the boyfriend who doesn't know yet she's gonna leave him, washing his car out back, and he's a runty little guy and drinks too much, and it's not his kid anyway, but he loves her. He really does. He loves them both. Any thoughts on this poem?
What makes this like a poem that you love so much that you would memorize it?
I just, it itches that part of my brain that when something is, I talk about this a lot with my own poems, where I find it very inspiring when people enter a poem in like the most absurd way possible and then get really deep with it. I really find that it's for me that doorway of taking like kind of the absurd or the like kind of cruddy and going really deep with it. I find that it just does something for my brain. Like I find it really interesting. Like I kind of like that we've got like this grubby swan. I think that's like brilliant. And I think this poem does it really, really brilliantly. And it almost feels like the answer to why I love these types of poems so much because I feel like we don't need, again, I talk a lot about beauty and like what makes things beautiful in a poem versus like what things are actually beautiful in real life. And I really like poems that are really, really take a hard look at like kind of the grubbiness and the fact that this poem's got both. Like we've got a swan. If you had told me, I think I came across the poem the first time maybe like a year and a half ago. And if you had told me one of my favorite poems was going to have a swan in it, I'd be like, wrong. I'd be like, no, I don't, like, I won't, that's not for me. Like, I could just tell you right now. And because I'm not typically interested in poems that are gonna be, I don't really find myself that drawn to, and I think they're beautiful. Like, I can appreciate them from a technical standpoint, but in terms of what resonates with me, I find that like that kind of pastoral or kind of like looking at something that I already know is beautiful doesn't often really pull me in. And the way that she does it is so brilliant. Like, I think this is one of my favorite first lines in any poem. Isn't one of your prissy rich people's swans? It's very funny. It's very playful. You know, she's combines rich people's into one word. Like, it's very like I want to be friends with this person. Like I read this poem, like this is the kind of like, and I like poets that make me feel that way. I'm like, oh, okay, like this is funny. Um, and then wouldn't be at home on some pristine pond. The sounds, like she's got the plosive consonants here with the P's, so it's like sounds really good and juicy. And then like she's got the chooses the whole stinking shore. Like this, when I was memorizing this poem, like I would just say it over and over on walks to myself. And it was just fun to say, like, chooses the whole stinking shoreline, candy wrappers, condoms in its title, friend. It's very funny. It's very like, we're talking about a swan. We're talking about this grubby lake. I don't know where Edgewater Park is, but it's like very funny. Um, and then like she keeps going. Like she really doubles down, like prefers to curve its muscular, slightly grubby neck. Like I would never think to describe a swan's neck as slightly grubby. It's just funny. Um, and then swilling whatever it is swans swill. This admission of not knowing, which I think is really fun. Also, I think I really like when poets do this. I think Ada Limon has a poem where she says like, "Oh, I didn't know what type of bird it was." I know Maggie Smith has a poem where she says like, I think this is goldenrod, but I'm not sure if it's goldenrod. Like this kind of like admission of like, I don't know anything and I'm not gonna look it up. I'm not gonna give you the exact answer, which is really, really fun. Because I think that looking stuff up to like make your poems more accurate is really fun, but it also can be kind of nice and kind of like it almost feels like something a friend would say, which is, I think, a brilliant way to kind of again give that connection with the reader is like we've got this swilling whatever it is they swill. I don't know. I don't know what they eat. And then she makes a joke, the Chardonnay of algae with bouquet of crud. This marrying the high and low diction is really lovely. Like, you know, you've got the word like Chardonnay and then algae and then bouquet and then crud, like that kind of which creates this truth. It's like the beautiful and the ugly and then creating that truth, which I just love. And then obviously, I think what draws me into this poem the most is the big turn, which in this poem I think is very, very obvious, which is the beauty isn't the point here. Of course, the swan is beautiful, which is really nice because, you know, it's almost going back on what's been said. Like, you know, we've got this swan has a grubby neck. Like this, it's not a prissy rich people swan. And it's like, well, no, it is beautiful. Like it's kind of nice. It's this kind of like going back on what's been said a little bit and being okay with that and being like, well, you know, it is beautiful. But, and then this brilliant, brilliant simile. Like the poem ends on a simile, like this long and specific simile. I don't know how she came up with this. I don't know who Lori was. I don't know if this was a real poem. I mean, if this was a real person, if this was based on a real person, if this was based on an amalgamation of different people. Um, if I were writing this poem, I probably would do that. I probably wouldn't make it about like someone specific. Just because I would feel uncomfortable using these particular descriptions to describe someone I actually knew. But I think it works brilliantly. I love like all of this. She's got like the smoking her days off in her dirty kitchen, her kid with asthma watching TV, the boyfriend who doesn't know yet she's gonna leave him, like boom, 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 these kind of negative details. Um, and then like just the love, like loving something anyway. And that's really, really, really striking and beautiful. So I just found myself like totally like by the time I got to that last line, I was like, this is one of my favorite poems. I love the way it's pulled off. I love the way, you know, it's talking about beauty and I'm very interested in things that are beautiful that aren't supposed to be or the details that kind of pull it out of its original context of beauty and how it's still beautiful and like well what's beautiful she's gonna leave him and this guy loves this person who's gonna leave him like it's kind of sad And it's not his kid anyway. You've got these things, and it's like this love despite, this like really powerful, it kind of circling back to the thing that I think all these poems have is like this beauty despite, this like indulgence despite. It's like that fig in the Dorian Lex poem. It's like this love feels very much like that fig. It's like, or that flailing soul. You know, these poems have that like they kind of brave the truth of things. They brave the wholeness of things in a way that I find very, very compelling. And I kind of think that that's where that door is that moment where you go like, I'm gonna look at this straight on in the eyes, like unblinking, and I'm gonna say like, this is what it is. Um, and I feel like, you know, a lot of that is pulled off with the details um here. So
Thanks for answering that. Yeah, we're way over time, so sorry, I'm gonna have to
no,
I'm
no,
gonna get
I
out of
can
here.
keep talking forever. So, but yes, I am happy to let everyone go. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for being here, and that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good one. Bye. Let's all thank Lexi. See ya. Bye.